Hi there, and welcome back to Only the Best Fantasy Novels. Today I want to talk about the grand finale to the Dread Empire Chronicles by Glen, and that is the omnibus Wrath of Kings. This is the final trilogy in the Dread Empire Chronicles, and it's a finale 20 years in the making because someone decided it was a good idea to steal the manuscript for the eighth book from Glen Cook's home, and that kind of caused him to lose his momentum in the series. And for more than 20 years, the seventh book was just the last released in the series. And then when Nightshade Publishing decided to re-release the series with brand new covers by Raymond Swanland, they were able to convince him to write one final book in which he wraps up everything. So, yeah, that's a little bit of backstory for Wrath of Kings. And the reason why I bring it up is because it does play a part in how this story wraps up. But without further ado, let's get into it. The first book in the trilogy is Reap the East Wind. And in this book, we start to see some semblance of... We see like a little shift in how Glen Cook has been doing things so far. We see the quote-unquote formation of a central cast of characters who are clearly like the core of the series, whoever else may come and go. The first of those is Princess Mist, who is the rightful ruler of the Dread Empire. Her whole thing is she's fled to the west to try and get the assistance of King Bragi and his armies to reclaim her throne. And Bragi's willing to help, but of course he has his own ideas of what will happen once she reclaims that throne. We have Lady Nefanti, who starts to believe that her and Mokker's son is, despite what she's been told, he's actually alive, and she starts she starts to think about the ramifications of that. What else do we have going on? There's so much going on in this book. I think the other big thread is the rise of the Deliverer, who is the avatar of a forgotten god, and the chaos that he brings is on a whole other level than what we've seen so far. But yeah, that's the three main. For me at least, I would say like the three main character threads going into this book. There's a few other things going on, like we do have some POVs from the Dread Empire itself, and other political factors at play. But that's I think these three are the core of the book for me. Right off the bat, it becomes clear that this is just going to be a very unforgiving book. Between Lady Nefanti's dreams, feelings, whatever you want to call them, and the movements of the Deliverer, especially in terms of his identity and these kind of things. It's clear that there's very little chance of this ending well for anyone. And yeah, in true Glen Cook fashion, we pretty much get thrown straight into things. Very little setup. We kind of just take it and run with it as we go. I feel like I shouldn't even bother to mention that at this point because that's just the standard Glen Cook MO. But yeah, I like this book. We got thrown into the deep end, I think, a bit more than the others, and like more than once I found myself just going back and reading small parts just to make sure like I understood something right. And based on how the series has trended so far, you can already tell that this is pretty much one part of a story. We're gonna get another part of it later on. Yeah. there's that. For me, how the book ends with a certain character having having a moment that is very different from what they've been forced to endure throughout this entire series. It's the first time they were able to act with some amount of agency on their own, and it did have huge ramifications. It did have huge ramifications for all of like 5 pages, and then Glenn Cook was like, "Now that you're basically standing on the X in the middle of the rug that he set up for you," he just went and pulled it straight out from under you. All of 5 pages, if so much. But for what it was worth, that moment for me, it was a pretty good moment, because for that character, usually they're relegated as little more as a set piece or a side story, or a background part of the story in general. And it was nice to see them get their moment in the sun, even if it didn't last quite as long as we hoped. But yeah. Moving on to the second book in the trilogy, we have An Ill-Fate Marshalling. And this is pretty much the second half of Reap the East Wind. Just the way Reap the East Wind was written, like it was clear that this is just one aspect of a story, and we're going to get the other aspects, similar to what's happened at least once or twice in the series so far. And in An Ill-Fate Marshalling, we see the second half of the story, where we get a lot of the gaps filled in, a lot of the backstory. Nearly 80% of the book takes place concurrently with Reap the East Wind, and things are set at an angle where they become much more clear, much more specific. We get a lot more of King Braggy's side of things in this book, with some very unusual, with some very seemingly unusual scenes with him, but it did culminate in something that had very huge ramifications. So there was that. Initially it seemed very meandering, given this is Glenn Cook and he hates to write 2 words when he can write 1 word. But yeah, it was it for me, like, this book was in true Glenn Cook fashion. Like, it was just fast paced, intense. It at the same time, it was a little more slow than the other books, because it was more of backstory. It was more of political intrigue. Like, we kind of got to see the moments and the decisions that led to some of the things that we saw in Reap the East Wind. So by nature, it is a slightly slower story, but at the same time, it is a very compelling, very fascinating one. And then finally, we have the novel 20 plus years in the making, A Path to the Coldness of Heart. When I heard that title, and at one point I saw the full quote, I made a note of it just to enforce a comment I keep making throughout the series, that no one can turn a phrase the way Glenn Cook can. Let me read out the full quote here that the title comes from. And the quote is, "For the time of the wrath of kings is almost at hand, and vengeance lies along a path to coldness of heart." Like, who comes up with this stuff? Other than Glenn Cook. There's no one out there. Like, his writing itself has just like this sheer level of badassery that no one else can mimic. There's really no other way to phrase how this guy writes what he does. But yeah, this is the book with an almost 25-year gap, the one that Nightshade Publishing had to convince him to write. And right from the get-go, with how things started to play out, it immediately became clear that this wasn't going to be a massively successful landing, mainly because the Dread Empire Chronicles was planned to be a 14 series book, and Unfortunately, Glenn Cook has to take 7 books worth of story and wrap it all up in one book, one 8 book. And as we know from Glenn Cook, he's no writer of small animal killers. He writes by fantasy standards, he writes very slim books. So because of that, like there's just so much that kind of gets packed in and comes to a head in such a rapid way that in many times it feels forced. It can sometimes feel contrived, but in the end, what does matter is we did get a conclusion, some amount of closure, a finale of some kind, like a proper finale. Um, it's unfortunate that many of the original fans of this series, um, they, who knows if they made it 25 years, to wait 25 years to this finale. And so I consider us fortunate to be able to have experienced it, I should say. And yeah, that kind of sums up. I could talk about more specific sums of the book, but because it's so it deals with so many things specific to the series, like it's very hard not to spoil anything, which is why I'm kind of more giving more backstory about the nature of the book and that kind of thing. I enjoyed this finale. Like it's twisty, it's convoluted. In true Glenn Cook fashion, it's an ending where the characters, we leave them in some not necessarily great places, not necessarily bad places on a case by case basis. Um, but yeah, I'm pretty happy we got it. Um, Holy crap, this video is already 12 minutes and no one watches this much of my videos, so I think I'll call it there. Overall, a really great wrap up to what's been a really great series. For once, I made it all the way to the end without once comparing this to Malazan. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on the finale. If you guys have read this or planning to read it or have some thoughts on it, let me know in the comments, and until next time.